Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to change gears a little bit and we're going to start looking at what's called two-way tables. So we're still in our statistics unit. We're actually still comparing categories of data, in this case two different categories of data, and we're comparing this data based off of one sample group. So what I mean by that, and in a lot of these instances what we're going to be seeing is we're going to be taking a population and we're going to be basically sampling that population and seeing what preferences maybe this population has in terms of two different categories. So if we take a look at example number one, we're starting with a population or a sample group of 440 students. And we're going to be categorizing these students based on a survey that includes the categories of students that are on honor roll, as well as students that play a sport. And now something that's very interesting with two-way tables is they're very similar to Venn diagrams, and we're going to see that in this first example. So there might be students, if we're looking at example one, in our population, in our sample group, there might be students that are only on the honor roll and do not play a sport at all. There might be students that play a sport, but they are not on the honor roll. There might be students that are on the honor roll and they play a sport. And there might be students that are not on the honor roll and don't play a sport. So we're making all of these different categories based off of our sample group. So if we take a look at the table, of the 440 students, 115 of those students are only on the honor roll. They do not play a sport, they're strictly on the honor roll. Of the 440 students, 45 of them only play a sport. They are not on the honor roll. And 250 of those students play a sport and are on the honor roll. Now, one thing that's missing from this table is students that are not on the honor roll and do not play a sport. So I'm going to actually add in kind of a little space at the bottom where I'm just going to say no, hang on. Gotta get my pen ready, where it says no sport, or I'll say HR for honor roll. So remember, we're looking at a sample group of 440 students. Now, if 115 of those students are on the honor roll only, 45 students play a sport only, and 250 do both, that brings us up to 410 students, but we sampled 440. So if 410 occupy those first three categories, then 30 students don't fall into either. So 30 students don't play a sport and they're not on the honor roll. So that's just something that we have to keep in mind so we can accurately fill in the rest of our information. If I was to create a Venn diagram, my Venn diagram would look something like this. I would probably put, and I'm going to abbreviate here, I would maybe say this circle represents kids that are on the honor roll. This circle represents any students that play a sport. The center is for students that do both. And then the space outside of our circles, but inside the rectangle, this would be our neither category. So this is our folks that don't do either. And if I were to fill in some numbers maybe to go along with these, my folks that are on the honor roll only, there's 115 people that are only on the honor roll. There's 45 that only play a sport. There's 250 that do both. And then there's 30 that do neither. So this is how we would potentially fill in a Venn diagram with this information from our sample group as it relates to two different categories, honor roll versus a sport. So our two-way table is actually really, really similar to our Venn diagram. So you'll see with our two-way table, we have one category on the top going across in a row. So our rows, remember, go right to left. So here's our row. And our columns are up and down. So across the top, we're looking at students that play sports. So you'll see there's a section for kids that play, kids that don't play, and then a total. Okay, now we also have our one category going down the column. Sorry about that. So going down a column here, we have kids that are on the honor roll, kids that are not on the honor roll, and then a total. Okay, so when we start to fill in some information here, and I'm just going to get rid of my arrows for a second just so it's not super confusing. When we start filling in some information, we have to be really careful where we place it as far as which box coordinates with our numbers. So for example, this first box here, okay, this first box here is made up of students that play a sport and are on the honor roll. So if you notice, like if you take your fingers, right, and you put one finger on where it says on honor roll and one finger on where it says play, that box is where those two intersect. So we're looking at a student that plays a sport and is on the honor roll. So if I go back to my table or even my Venn diagram, this is a student that is involved in both. And you'll notice in my table here, play a sport and are on honor roll, that's 250 kids that do that. Okay, so now if I move over one, it doesn't matter, however you want to fill in this table is fine. I'm going to move over one to where it says not play. So not play and is on the honor roll. Again, those two, if I take my fingers and I kind of follow the column in the row here, those two are going to intersect in this space here. So this space here is for kids that are on the honor roll, but they don't play a sport. So on the honor roll only, and that was 115 students. Now this total space right here, this total space is for the number of kids that occupy that row. So this total space is for the number of kids that are on the honor roll. So the total number of kids that are on the honor roll would be 250 plus 115. Now that total space, it doesn't matter if the student also plays a sport or doesn't play a sport, it's just referencing kids that are on the honor roll. And of the 440 students that were surveyed, 365 are on the honor roll. All right, so filling in the rest of my table here, now I'm going to start looking at the not honor roll row. So if I go not honor roll but plays a sport, again, take your fingers, come down the play column, go across the not honor roll row, and you're going to see that they're going to meet right here. So this space tells us the student is not on the honor roll, but they do play a sport. So sport only, there's 45 kids that fall under that category. The next box over to the right, this is for kids or students that are not on the honor roll and do not play a sport. So they don't do either one. Well, we have 30 kids that fall under that category. Remember, no sport or honor roll. All right, so what is our total? What is our total for the number of students that are not on the honor roll at all? So we're now looking at this next box to the right here, and we're saying, okay, so what's the total number of kids that did not make honor roll? Well, we're going to add 45 and 30, and that gives us 75 kids total that are not on the honor roll at all. These totals on the bottom have to do with our column totals. Okay, so our total, this first box here, has to do with kids that play a sport. Now, it doesn't matter if they're on the honor roll or not, they're going to be included in this total no matter what. So we're going to add 250 and 45, and we come up with 295 students. So that 295 means this is how many kids play a sport. They might be on the honor roll, they might not. Doesn't matter, they play a sport. If I move over one column to the right, now I'm looking at the total number of students that don't play a sport at all. So I'm going to take 115 and I'm going to add 30 to it. So I'm going to add all the numbers in that column. And this tells me how many students do not play a sport. Okay. So there's 145 kids that don't play a sport at all. Now this last and final box here, this is the total number of students surveyed. The total number of students. Now we know how many kids were surveyed. It told us that over here, 440. Now what we want to make sure of is if I add together my column and my row, I should get 440 no matter which way I add. So let's start with 365 plus 75. If I add my column together, I get 440. Perfect, which is what I'm supposed to get. How about 295 and 145? Yep, I get 440 again. So that bottom right, where our two totals come together, so our total from our columns and our total from our rows, that should give us our sample group, our population that we took the sample from, which was 440 students. All right. Let's go ahead and try and do this, and we're going to do it a little bit quicker here. So in example 2, Luke surveyed students and found that 78 students own a cell phone. Okay. 78 students own a cell phone. Let's look at our table for a second. Cell phone goes across the row. We know that 78 students total own a cell phone. Right now we know nothing about them owning MP3 players. We just know that there is a total of 78 students that own a cell phone. That's all we know so far. Okay, so in addition to that, we have 78 students own a cell phone and 57 of those students own an MP3 player. So 57 of the 78 students own an MP3 player. So I'm going to say they own a cell phone and an MP3 player. Now, I can easily fill in this no MP3 player section of that row because if there's 78 kids total that have a cell phone and 57 of those 78 also have an MP3 player, that leaves 78 minus 57, that leaves 21 kids that have a cell phone but no MP3 player, and that's okay. All right, so now let's keep going. There are 13 students that do not own a cell phone. Okay, so 13 students, so no cell phone, that's a total value. It tells us nothing about MP3 players yet. It just says 13 kids don't own a cell phone. So 13 students that do not own a cell, oops, sorry. See, I should have finished reading. That was my fault. All right, sorry about that. So there are 13 students that do not own a cell phone, but own an MP3 player. So my apologies. So no cell phone, but an MP3 player. This is where the 13 goes. Sorry about that. 9 students do not own either device. So 9 don't own either. No cell phone, no MP3 player. That is this box right here. I'm going to put a 9 right there. Now we're going to complete the two-way table given our information. We kind of already started to do that with the cell phone row above, and we're just going to keep going from here. So to finish my no cell phone row, I have 13 folks that don't have a cell phone, but they do have an MP3 player, and I have 9 folks that have no cell phone and no MP3 player. So how many total people do not have a cell phone from Luke's survey? Well, 13 plus 9 gives me 21. Nope, no it does not. I was going to say my adding is wrong. How terrible is that? Okay, gives me 22. There we go. All right, I had 21 on my paper. Okay, so now let's start filling in some of our column totals. So how many kids have an MP3 player? So let's take a look at that column. MP3 player, we're looking down here. So total kids that have an MP3 player, 57 plus 13 gives me 70. So 70 kids have an MP3 player. How many kids do not have an MP3 player? We're going to keep looking down this column here. It looks to be 21 plus 9. There's 30 kids that do not have an MP3 player. How many total folks were surveyed? Well, remember, that's that bottom right corner. We're going to add together our column, and we're going to make sure that our total for our column is the same as our total for the rows. So 78 plus 22 gives me 100. That's the same for 70 and 30. So out of 100 students surveyed, you can see how many own a cell phone, how many own an MP3 player, how many own both, and how many own neither. Taking a look at example 3, there's 150 children at summer camp. 150 children at summer camp. Now, if you look at your table, we're comparing the two categories here, are canoeing and swimming. So that 150 children at summer camp, that's our total. That's our total sample, our total population. And if you remember where that goes in the bottom right corner. Okay. 71 signed up for swimming. All right, that doesn't tell us anything about canoeing though. It strictly talks to us about swimming. So looking at the row for swimming here, my total number of swimmers is 71. There were a total of 62 children that signed up for canoeing. Okay, so there's a total of 62 children that signed up for canoeing. Okay, canoeing is a column. So total number of children that signed up for canoeing, total 62. 28 of them also signed up for swimming. Okay, so of that 62, 28 signed up for canoeing and swimming. So we've got to think what box holds 28, and that's going to be this one right here, canoeing and swimming. Now we're going to complete the rest of the 2A table given all of this information, which really isn't a ton, but I know we can do it. So the first thing I see is I can fill in the folks that signed up for swimming and no canoeing because I have the total number of swimmers and I have the total number of folks that chose swimming and canoeing. So if I had 71 swimmers total, 28 of them also signed up for canoeing. That leaves 43 that are going to swim, but they're not going to canoe. Same idea here. I have 62 kids that signed up for canoeing. 28 of those 62 are also going to swim. So 62 minus 28, that leaves 34 kids that are signed up for canoeing, but they're not going to go swimming. All right, so let's keep going here. Using my totals, so my total in my row and my total in my column, I can actually pull together some more numbers as well. If the total number of children at summer camp is 150, knowing that 71 of those 150 are going to be swimming, that leaves me with 79, 150 minus 71. So 79 kids are not going to swim. And if out of that 150, 62 of them are going to canoe, how many are not going to canoe? Well, 150 minus 62 is 88. So 88 students will not canoe. All right, last but not least, how many people aren't going to be canoeing and aren't going to be swimming? Well, it looks like we have a total of 88 people that aren't going to canoe. Of those 88, 43 will be swimming. So how many people are going to do neither? 45. 45 are not going to canoe and they're not going to swim. Okay? All right, last but not least, example 4. Elise surveyed the students in her cafeteria and found that 38 males agree with the new cafeteria rules, while 70 do not. Okie dokie. So some of the categories we have here, males versus females, agreeing with rules, not agreeing with rules, and our totals. Okay, so 38 males agree with the new cafeteria rules. Agree with rules, males 38. 70 of the males do not agree with the rules. Okay, so 70 do not, 38 do. That gives me 108 total males surveyed. There were 92 females surveyed. Okay, that tells us nothing about them agreeing or disagreeing with the rules. We just know that 92 females were surveyed. There were 92 females surveyed and 41 of them agree with the new cafeteria rules. Okay, so females that agree, 41. We're going to construct the two-way table summarizing the data. So now we're going to fill in the rest here. Okay, so some things that I can do right away. If I look at the column that says agree with rules, it looks like 38 males and 41 females agree with rules. So how many total students agree with the new rules? Well, 41 plus 38 gives us 79. If I look at the females row here, 92 females were surveyed, 41 agree with the rules. So how many don't agree with the rules? 92 minus 41 gives us 51. All right, so looking at some totals here, how many males and females, now I'm going to look at this column, how many males and females do not agree with the rules? Well, 70 plus 51 gives me 121 males and females that do not agree with these new rules. How many total students were surveyed? Okay, so that's this bottom right corner here. What's the total? Well, let's see. 108 plus 92 gives me 200. Is that the same for my row here total? 79 and 121 also gives me 200. Yep, so 200 students were surveyed total. All right, everybody, let's jump to the second page and let's talk about relative frequency. So relative frequency, as you can see, we're going to be using those two-way tables again. Relative frequency talks about how often something happens compared to the total or all possible outcomes for that particular category. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take how often something happens and we're going to divide it by all the outcomes. All right, and what this does is it just helps us to determine possible associations between the data. It allows us to take the numbers for how often something happens and kind of look at it a little differently. We're often going to see relative frequency as a decimal. You could also use relative frequency as a percent. But as we go through, you'll kind of get a better picture of why we use relative frequency and how it helps us make associations between data. So with relative frequency, what's helpful is to determine, are we looking at the categories by row or are we looking at them by column? So in example 1, we're actually going to look at one of the examples from the first page. We're going to look at this example by row to start. So you can see right underneath where it says example 1. We're going to take a look at the numbers here by row and we're going to find the relative frequency for the number of students who own a cell phone as well as an MP3 player compared to the total number of students that own a cell phone. And similarly, we're going to be looking at the number of students who own a cell phone and don't have an MP3 player compared to the total number of students that own a cell phone. So we're going to be reading these row by row and we're going to be finding the relative frequencies that way. So let's go ahead and get started. So we have the original table off to the left here. We're going to be using the table to the right to find our relative frequency by row. So if I'm just looking at the top row where it's talking about students that have a cell phone, we're going to compare students that have a cell phone and an MP3 player to the total number of students that have a cell phone, and we're going to compare students that have a cell phone and no MP3 player to the total number of students that have a cell phone. So if I'm going to fill in some numbers here really quickly, my total, okay, so the total number of students, so just to make sure I have this, is 78. Now I'm going to put, you can see kind of the way the tables are set up below. I'm going to put this little semicolon here and I'm going to put a 1.0. So what the 1.0 means is that is going to be kind of like our total. So 1.0 represents all students that own a cell phone. And we're going to see what fraction or what portion of them fall under each of the categories, cell phone and MP3 player, versus that total, as well as cell phone and no MP3 player versus that total. So using that total number of students who have a cell phone, which is 78, I know that there's 57 that own a cell phone as well as an MP3 player. Now to find the relative frequency, I'm going to take the 57 that own both and divide it by the 78 that we know definitely have a cell phone. Now 57 divided by 78, I'm going to round to the nearest hundredth here, and I'm going to squeeze this in. 57 divided by 78 gives me 0.73. I'm not going to be writing as much in the next couple of boxes, so bear with me here. So out of 1.0, out of all students that own a cell phone, okay, 0.73 of that 1.0 have a cell phone and MP3 player. If we look at this as a percent, we can take that 0.73 and turn it into a percent by multiplying it by 100. So that's kind of the same thing as saying 73% of kids that own a cell phone also own an MP3 player. So again, just kind of a different way of looking at our data that we had collected originally. So what decimal, what percent of kids own a cell phone and no MP3 player compared to kids that, all the kids I should say, that own a cell phone? We're going to take 21, which is 21 kids that own a cell phone but don't own an MP3 player. We're going to divide it by the total number of kids that own a cell phone. And again, rounding to the nearest hundredth, I get 0.27. So that's the same thing as saying 0.27 out of the whole, or out of the total number of kids own a cell phone and no MP3 player. You can also look at it as 27% of all of the kids that own a cell phone don't own an MP3 player as well. All right, so looking at the next row, now I'm looking at all the kids that don't own a cell phone. So in our survey, there are 22 kids that do not own a cell phone. Okay, so this is going to be our 1.0. All 22 kids would be our 1.0. So how many of those kids own an MP3 player but do not own a cell phone? So we said there's 13 kids that own an MP3 player that don't own a cell phone. So 13 out of the 22. And if I put that in as a decimal, again, rounding to the nearest hundredth, I get 0.59. And I'm using the approximatelys here because our decimals do continue on much more past that hundredths place, so we're just going to round it, so we're approximating that value. All right, moving on to my next box here. How many kids that don't own a cell phone also don't own an MP3 player? Well, we said that was 9 out of the 22 do not own a cell phone or an MP3 player. To find the relative frequency, I divide those two things and I come up with, again, this is an approximate number, 0.41. Now you'll notice if you read the rows from left to right, you'll notice that our boxes should add up to a total of 1. So if we're looking at the cell phone row, so all kids that own a cell phone, 0.73 have a cell phone and MP3 player, 0.27 have a cell phone and no MP3 player. If you add those two things together, that adds up to our 1.0. That makes up all of the kids that we know have a cell phone. All right, let's keep practicing here. So now we're going to look at or find the relative frequency by column. Okay, and we'll make sure to let you know how we want you to find the relative frequency by row or column. So in this case, we're going to look at column. So we're looking at the total number of kids now that own an MP3 player versus the total number of kids that do not own an MP3 player. So let's start with the total number of kids that do own an MP3 player. So this one's already filled in for you a little bit. Notice how we have a total of 70 kids that own an MP3 player. Out of those 70, 57 also own a cell phone. So if I'm going to find the relative frequency, I'm going to take 57 divided by 70, and that gives me approximately 0.81. Again, I'm saying approximate because I'm rounding to the nearest hundredth. All right, so now let's look at the number of students that own an MP3 player and do not own a cell phone. 13 out of the 70 Kids that own an MP3 player do not own a cell phone. And if I find the relative frequency, if I do my division here, 13 divided by 70 gives me approximately 0.19. Now that 70, this total number, this is 1.0. This is every single student that owns an MP3 player. So that's my 1.0, my one total. And if you look, 0.81 plus 0.19 does add up to 1.0. So we've included all of the students here. So the way we can look at this is if we turn it into a percentage, 81% of kids that own an MP3 player also own a cell phone. 19% of kids that own an MP3 player do not own a cell phone. So that's just another way of kind of reading this information that we have here. Looking at all the kids that do not own an MP3 player, which is 30, that's this number down here. Okay, so this is our 1.0. This is all 30 kids combined. 21 of those 30 own a cell phone, but don't own an MP3 player. So finding the relative frequency there, 21 divided by 30 gives us approximately 0.70. All right, out of the folks that do not own an MP3 player, 9 also don't own a cell phone. So 9 of the 30 kids also don't own a cell phone. And when I divide that out, I get approximately 0.30. So 0.7 plus 0.3 adds up to 1.0. What this is telling me is about 70% of kids that do not own an MP3 player do own a cell phone, and about 30% of kids that do not own an MP3 player also do not own a cell phone. All right, let's take a look at example 2. So the two-way table shows how some students get their news. Find and interpret the relative frequencies of students in the survey by row. All right, so we're moving from left to right here. So the first row that I'm going to be looking at is the 7th grade students and how they get their news. Now, in order for me to find relative frequency, I need to know how many 7th graders took part in this survey. So adding together the number of students that chose TV, the number of students that chose internet, it looks like the total number of 7th graders that were surveyed is 62. So again, this is my 1.0. Okay. So now we're going to use that 1.0 or that 62 total students, and we're going to see what the relative frequency is based on the number of 7th graders that watch TV to get their news. So it looked like 13 of the 62 watch TV. Okay, I'm going to squeeze this in here. So 13 out of 62, and that gives me approximately 0.21. Okay, now 49 of the 62 7th graders get their news from the internet. Now 49 out of 62 gives me, and I have to double check if this was approximately or not. Yeah, approximately 0.79. 0.21 and 0.79 do add up to 1.0. Again, reading this, 21% of the 7th graders get their news from the TV, 79% get their news from the internet. Looking at 8th graders, how many 8th graders were surveyed? Well, 20 plus 68 gives us 88 8th graders surveyed. That's going to be my 1.0. That's all of the 8th graders. Out of the 88 8th graders, 20 of them get their news from TV. So to find the relative frequency here, 20 divided by 88 gives me approximately 0.23. Okay. And then looking at 68 here, so 68 out of the 88 students surveyed gives us a relative frequency of approximately 0.77. So looking at this, about 23% of 8th graders get their news from the TV, 77% get their news from the internet. Looking at totals, so now we can still kind of use our columns to help us here with our relative frequency. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the relative frequency of 7th and 8th graders who get their news from the TV compared to all of the students that were surveyed. So the total number of students surveyed, that's going to be this bottom right here. The total number of students surveyed, 88 and 62, if I add those two numbers together, that gives me 150 total students. So that's 7th and 8th graders combined. Of those 150 students, how many get their news from the TV? Well, let's add this together. 13 7th graders, 20 8th graders, that gives us 33 students. So to find the relative frequency, 33 out of the 150 is approximately 0.22. All right, now let's look at the internet. Out of the 7th and 8th graders, 49 plus 68 gives me 117. Now 117 divided by 150 gives us approximately 0.78. So 22% of 7th and 8th graders surveyed get their news from the TV. 78% of 7th and 8th graders get their news from the internet. All right, last but not least, let's look at example number 3. The two-way table shows the number of students that do or do not do chores at home and whether they receive an allowance. Find and interpret the relative frequencies of students in the survey by columns. So remember, columns go up and down. All right, so by columns, we're looking at allowance versus no allowance, and if people do chores or not. So if we're going to look at the first column here, which is allowance, so again, we're going to look down this way. Ooh, don't mind that crazy arrow. All right, so looking down this way, how many kids get an allowance? Let's look at it that way. Whether they do chores or not, how many kids get an allowance? Well, 13 plus 5 gives us a total of 18. So 18 kids get an allowance whether they do chores or not. Now 13 of those 18 do chores. So the relative frequency, 13 divided by 18, is 0.72, approximately. Now 5 out of the 18 don't do any chores, but they still get an allowance. Wow, aren't those kids lucky? All right, so 5 divided by 18 gives us approximately 0.28. Now all 18 kids, that gives us a total of 1.0. So 0.72 plus 0.28 does give us 1.0, and the way we would read this is 72% of kids that receive an allowance do chores, 28% that receive an allowance do not do chores. All right, taking a look at our next column here, which has to do with no allowance at all. How many total kids, whether they do chores or not, how many total kids do not get an allowance? Well, 3 plus 4 is 7. There's 7 people surveyed, 7 students surveyed that do not get an allowance at all. All right, now 3 of those 7 still do chores. They just don't get paid for it. So 3 divided by 7 gives us approximately 0.43. Okay, again, all of these relative frequencies, we're going to round to the nearest hundredth just to make life easy on us. All right, 4 out of the 7 don't get an allowance and they don't do any chores. So that gives us a relative frequency of about 0.57. And we know that all 7 total folks that don't get an allowance would be our 1.0. So the way we would look at that information is 43% of kids that don't get an allowance do chores, where 57% of kids that don't get an allowance don't do any chores. All right, now let's take a look at this total. So the first thing I want to figure out is, remember, this bottom right corner tells us how many total kids were surveyed, whether they got an allowance or not. How many kids are we talking about here? Well, 18 total kids get an allowance, 7 do not. That makes 25 kids surveyed total. So that's my 1.0. Now, how many kids, whether they receive an allowance or not, do chores? Well, let's add. 13 kids plus 3 gives us 16. Okay. Now, of these 16 kids, so 16 out of 25 total do chores. Okay, so 16 out of 25 total do chores. Now, actually, if I do 16 divided by 25, I don't need an approximately here. This is going to give me an exact value. So 16 divided by 25 gives me 0.64, relative frequency of 0.64. Now let's talk about kids that don't do chores. Well, 9 kids don't do chores at all. And some of them get an allowance and some of them do not. Now 9 out of all 25 kids surveyed, 9 divided by 25, again, that's going to give me something, this is going to give me a nice round value of 0.36. So kind of reading this column here, 64% of kids do chores, 36% of kids do not do chores.